State-sponsored terrorism is defined as the active support of a terrorist group's activities by a state. Pretty standard definition there. States can sponsor terrorist groups in several ways, including but not limited to funding terrorist organizations, providing training for the terrorists, supplying weapons, providing other logistical and intelligence assistance, and hosting terrorist groups within their borders. Now, state-sponsored terrorism is not the same as state terror, which is where the state perpetrates violence upon its own population or another state's civilian population for the purposes of spreading fear and terror. State terrorism will be its own video later on, but now, like most videos, there are a lot of examples of state-sponsored terrorism, but for the purposes of this video, I'm primarily going to look at 5 brief cases of state-sponsored terrorism. The first case study I have is the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan's KGB, meaning State Intelligence Agency. The DRA's KGB worked closely with the KGB during the Soviet-Afghan War to support terrorist attacks in Pakistan with the goal of lowering Pakistani and U.S. support for the Mujahideen. On January 9th, the KGB was changed to the WAD, standing for Wazarat-e-Amaniyat Dawlati, or Ministry of State Security, but I'll use the names here interchangeably. Hundreds of civilians and thousands were injured as a result of the KGB campaign, with hundreds of attacks taking place from 1980 to 1989, and most of them taking place from 1987 to 1989, and some even occurring in the early 90s. The WAD actively supported car bombings and attempted a car bombing of the U.S. consulate and other bombings, plane hijackings, and there's even one instance where the KGB/WAD released a serial killer upon Pakistan, and he butchered a lot of people. Next up is the USSR. Now, the Soviet Union and KGB actively supported and sponsored many terrorist groups and attacks, so I will not be able to cover them all here. From the formation of the Soviet Union, the NKVD conducted terrorist attacks in Poland in the 1920s, with some taking place at universities, others in cities, and the largest being at the Warsaw Citadel bombing of 1923. However, the high of Soviet state-sponsored terrorism obviously came during the Cold War, where the USSR supported communist terrorist groups in committing attacks. Some of the notable groups were the Red Army faction, PLO, PFLP, FSLN, and the Red IRA. There are also a lot of other cases where the Soviets and KGB had other intelligence organizations such as the East German Stasi and Czechoslovak STB go out and support terrorist groups that the Soviets did not want to have a direct connection to. But additional Soviet state-sponsored terrorism has been related to their biological weapons programs. One of the most notable was the planned poisoning of the Potomac River in the late 1980s and early 90s as part of the Soviet contingency plan for if war between the US and USSR broke out. 2 ex-Soviet operatives have discussed in great detail how they would have poisoned the drinking water of Washington, D.C. and the food processing plant as well. And this was all after the Chemical Biological Weapons Conference of the 1970s, which outlawed all of these types of weapons in warfare. There were also many biological weaponized programs by the USSR, which included research and development of weaponized Ebola, smallpox, and antibiotic-resistant pathogens. I highly recommend you look up some of these for yourself, as I don't want this video to also get age-restricted. But relating back to the state-sponsored terrorism, the USSR gave Saddam Hussein weaponized smallpox in the early 1990s before the disillusionment of the USSR. At the same time, Saddam loved to genocide the Kurds in northern Iraq and the Shia in southern Iraq. Third is Syria under the Bashar al-Assad regime. Syria is widely known to have been responsible for the assassination of former Lebanese Prime Minister Rafik Hariri in 2005 with a truck bomb, which also killed 22 people in Beirut while injuring another 220. But the Iraq War is where Syria's time of state-sponsored terrorism really shines. Throughout the years of the insurgency in Iraq, thousands of al-Qaeda fighters entered Iraq through Syria, and Syrian intelligence provided crucial material and logistical support not just to Ba'athist insurgents, but also to al-Qaeda in Iraq, who carried out the Amman bombings. Syria was also widely known for increasing its support for various terrorist groups throughout the Iraq War until the Syrian Civil War came, and everything started to bite them in the butt when all of these terrorist groups started to join other Syrian resistance and rebel factions, which then fought against Assad. Next up, we got Venezuela, which under the reign of Hugo Chavez and under the current administration as of 2024 of Nicolas Maduro has provided extensive support to the FARC and ELN terrorist groups. The Chavez regime gave ammunition and training to FARC in urban terrorism, targeted killings, and the use of explosives explicitly against the Colombian government. There had also been FARC EP training camps in Venezuela under Chavez identified by satellites, which Maduro denied extensively when he was foreign minister. And under Maduro, some Venezuelan government officials had engaged in supporting Hezbollah, and Maduro had tolerated an ELN presence in Venezuela, and they backed him up in the Venezuelan presidential crisis. Last and certainly not least for state-sponsored terrorism is Iran. Since the Iranian Revolution of 1979, the state has been a big and proud sponsor of terrorist groups such as Hezbollah, the PFLP, Hamas, Houthis, and many more. Iran has also established the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, to domestically promote the government's policies, and since 1979, the IRGC has been accused of spreading its ideology into neighboring regions by training and funding terrorist organizations. By 1986, the IRGC had 350,000 members and even had a small Navy and Air Force as a little sub-force to the regular Iranian air and naval forces. By 1996, its ground forces numbered over 100,000 and the naval forces increased to 20,000. Many of these Iranian-trained and funded groups have gone on to spread terror throughout the Middle East. Hezbollah, for example, among many other of their acts of terrorism, committed a buttload of hijackings, the 1983 Marine barracks bombings, and led the 1982 to 1992 Lebanon hostage crisis. Iranian state-sponsored terrorist groups in the Iraq War also prolonged the war and led to many fatalities as well as casualties through IEDs, and also increased the sectarianism within the Iraq War. However, one of the more frightening pieces of Iranian state-sponsored terrorism is the Iranian elements within Iraqi security forces, more specifically the Popular Mobilization Forces branch. The Popular Mobilization Forces had started as Iranian-backed militias during the war against ISIS. However, several groups within the PMF were terrorist groups which Iran enthusiastically supported. The PMF forces also killed many Iraqi civilians for the purposes of, quote, revenge, unquote, for ISIS attacks, which made absolutely no sense. But the PMF was folded into the Iraqi armed forces, and Iran controls many terrorist militias that are part of the PMF that now operate as part of the Iraqi state. Did you know about these brief cases of state-sponsored terrorism before this video? Is there anything else that I should have elaborated more on, or other cases that I should have talked about, such as Pakistan, Gaddafi's Libya, Cuba, and more? Write in the comments, and thank you for watching.